Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the fourth Majlis of Khamsa Zainabiyya. To start the Majlis, may I please call upon Ammar to recite Quran.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الرحمن علم القرآن خلق الإنسان علمه البيان الشمس والقمر بحسبان والنجم والشجر يسجدان والسماء رفعها ووضع الميزان ألا تطغوا في الميزان وأقيموا الوزن بالقسط ولا تخسروا الميزان والأرض وضعها للأنام فيها فاكهة والنخل ذات الأكمام والحب ذو العصف والريحان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Please call upon Abbas to recite Salam.
صلوات اللهم صل على محمد وعلى
Wajil Farjan.
بعد صبا جا کے یہ امو کو بتانا پیاسی ہے سکینہ اے باد صبا جا کے یہ امو کو بتانا پیاسی ہے سکینہ یاد آئے سکینہ تو چچا لوٹ کے آنا پیاسی ہے سکینہ اس چھوٹے سے سن میں وہ ستم میں نے اٹھائے اللہ کسی کو نہ یتیم ایسا بنائے خود اپنے لہو میں کوئی بچی نہ نہائے میں تم کو بلاتی رہی تم بھی تو نہ آئے میں بن گئی عدسر لینوں کا نشانہ پیاسی ہے سکینہ اے باد صبا جا کے یہ امو کو بتانا پیاسی ہے سکینہ پانی کی طلب مجھ کو کھلاتی رہی ٹھوکر کہتا تھا نہیں دوں گا میں فوجوں کو پلا کر جب شمر لئی کر چکا سیراب یہ لشکر دکھلا کے مجھے پھینک دیا پانی زمیں پر تب سمجھی میں کیا ہوتا ہے امید دلانا پیاسی ہے سکینہ اے باد صبا جا کے یہ امو کو بتانا پیاسی ہے سکینہ ایک جام ہوا شام غریباں میں میسر وہ کوزہ میں رکھ آئی تھی اصغر کی لحد پر، تھا مجھ سے بھی چھوٹا میرا بھیا میرا دلبر، شرمندہ میں ہو جاتی چچا پیاس بجھا کر، اب اپنے ہی ہاتھوں سے میری پیاس بجھانا، پیاسی ہے سکینہ اے باد صبا جا کے یہ اموں کو بتانا، پیاسی ہے سکینہ۔ ایک رسی میں ہم سب کے گلے باندھ کے آدھا کرتے ہوئے تشہیر چلے جانب کوفہ، اور اس پہ مصیبت یہ تھی قد چھوٹا تھا میرا، اٹھتی تھی جو پھوپھیا تو گلا کھچتا تھا میرا، گردن کا میرا زخم چچا دیکھنے آنا، پیاسی ہے سکینہ اے باد صبا جا کے یہ اموں کو بتانا، پیاسی ہے سکینہ۔ جس روز سے اصغر کو ملا بابا کا سینہ، اس روز سے اموں نہیں سو پائی سکینہ، اس حال میں جاؤں گی میں کس طرح مدینہ، آ جائے مجھے موت ہے کس کام کا جینا، جاگی ہو بہت آ کے چچا مجھ کو سلانا، پیاسی ہے سکینہ اے باد صبا جا کے یہ اموں کو بتانا، پیاسی ہے سکینہ، پیاسی ہے سکینہ۔ صلی اللہم محمد۔
Muhammad wa ala Muhammad ajil farajun. Thank you for that recitation, Abbas. Can I also please call upon Sibtain to recite a salam?
صلوات علی محمد و آل محمد۔
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad wa ajil farajun.
بابا جان کیا میں کہوں کیا نہ کہوں رنج و علم، شام غم حال سفر شام کے زندہ کے ستم، اپنے غم تم بھی سناؤ اپنے غم میں بھی سناؤں، اپنے غم تم بھی سناؤ اپنے غم میں بھی سناؤں، بابا جان شمرے نے جب مارے تماچے منہ پر، بالی آنکھیں چی میری کرتا ہوا خون میں تر، بابا جان دیکھو ذرا نیل ہے رخسار میرے، کیا یتیموں پہ ستم کرتا ہے یوں کوئی بشر، شمر کو دیکھ کے میں خوف سے تھراتی ہوں، بھیا سجاد کے پیچھے ہی میں چھپ جاتی ہوں، اپنے غم تم بھی سناؤ اپنے غم میں بھی سناؤں، اپنے غم تم بھی سناؤ، اپنے غم میں بھی سناؤں. بابا جان بازو بندے، بابا جان بازو بندے، سب کے بندہ میرا گلا. جب رسن کھینچتی تھی دم گھٹتا تھا ہر گام میرا. بابا جان میں نے کیا، بابا جان میں نے کیا پنجوں پہ چل کر وہ سفر. درد ہوتا تھا تو چلاتی تھی بابا بابا. گش میں کھاتی تو زمین پر نہیں گر پاتی تھی. رسی اس طرح سے گردن میں پھنسی جاتی تھی. اپنے غم تم بھی سناؤ، اپنے غم میں بھی سناؤ. اپنے غم تم بھی سناؤ، اپنے غم میں بھی سناؤ. بابا جان دیکھنا کیا، بابا جان دیکھنا کیا، سن بھی نہ پاؤ گے بیاں. میرے رخسار پہ ظالم کی انگوٹھی کے نشان. بابا جان تم بھی مجھے، بابا جان تم بھی مجھے اب نہیں پہچانو گے. خاک بالوں میں لہو کانوں سے اب تک ہے رواں. صبر ہر غم پہ کیا، کیسے کیا مجھ سے سنو. 1300 میل سفر کیسے کیا مجھ سے سنو. اپنے غم تم بھی سناؤ، اپنے غم میں بھی سناؤں. بابا جون دادت بے جونا، بابا جون دادت بے جونا. بابا جان تم کو نہیں، بابا جان تم کو نہیں کیا میرے زخموں کی خبر. اب مجھے لوگ بلاتے ہیں یتیماں کہہ کر. بابا جان آج تلک، بابا جان آج تلک میں یہ سمجھ پائی نہیں. باپ کا جانا یتیمی یا اسیری ہے پدر. لوگ مجھ سے یہی کہتے ہیں کہ تو مانگ دعا. اب کسی کو بھی یتیمی نہ ملے تیری طرح. اپنے غم تم بھی سناؤ، اپنے غم میں بھی سناؤ. اپنے غم تم بھی سناؤ، اپنے غم میں بھی سناؤں. بابا جون دارد بے جونا، بابا جون دارد بے جونا. سلوات.
اپنا مائک آن کرے بیٹا.
Thank you for that recitation. It is now my pleasure to call upon Sayyid Mahdi Modarresi to commence the Majlis.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء وسيد المرسلين وحبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم محمد، وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المكرمين الغرر الميامين، سيما بقية الله في الأرضين وحجته على الخلائق أجمعين، سيدنا وإمام زماننا وصاحب نعمتنا وولي أمرنا، مهدي هذه الأمة وطاووس أهل الجنة، الحجة بن الحسن العسكري، فداه أرواح العالمين. Long regarded as the atheist nuclear option, the theory of evolution now appears more like a tiny bubble that's about to be burst by the merest of blows. Darwinian evolution has been touted as one of the strongest proofs of the hypothesis, the theory, the claim that this world has no creator. And it's been used by atheists and some agnostics as an excuse to abandon faith in God and to try and undermine the intelligent design and incredible perfection and exquisite beauty of the world around us. The idea that whatever exists in the world today, as beautiful and as finely tuned as it is the product of random natural processes and not the design of the creator of the universe. Now, as I said, perhaps in the early parts of the 20th century, perhaps in the 1950s, 60s, the theory of evolution might have been celebrated by many. And indeed, it was introduced into the national curriculums of many Western countries, including the United States. As of course, at the time, there were many other social changes that were taking place, and religion was beginning to take a back seat, and therefore the educational system in Western countries was used to present the ideas of Darwinian evolution as a counterweight to religion. However, the theory of evolution suffers from major flaws in its very design. I will focus on 3 of those flaws, and I will also provide some further reading material and some references for you to check out, inshallah, after this lecture. The first major flaw in the theory of evolution that I'd like to look at is the scientific inconsistencies of this theory. After all, it is but a theory. It's a hypothesis. They claim that there is overwhelming evidence to support it, but in fact, it remains a theory as opposed to a scientific fact. And it is it is a theory because it still suffers from a lot of scientific inconsistencies, which we will look at. The second major flaw in the theory of evolution is the problem of definitions, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Essentially, when people say theory of evolution, they may be talking about certain things, but those things do not further the cause of the theory. In particular, I want to look at micro versus macro evolution. And the third major flaw in the theory of evolution is the fact that it's an exercise in futility, meaning that it doesn't serve the intended purpose of refuting the need for an intelligent designer, the need for a creator and God. So we'll look at these 3 major critical flaws and problems within the theory of evolution, inshallah, in the time that we have at this session. The first one we said was the scientific inconsistencies of this theory. So the first problem is that there is a mismatched timeline. Allow me to elaborate on that. You see, the information and overwhelming complexity of the information that exists, whether it be in the DNA or in life as a whole, is so complex and so overwhelming that it could not have been generated by natural laws and random processes, especially given a 4 billion year old Earth and a 16 billion year old universe. In other words, the timeline, if evolution is true, then the timeline would have to be expanded by many factors over. The 4 billion year age of our Earth and the 16 billion year, roughly 16 billion year timeline and age of the universe is simply not enough to account for the incredible complexity and the sheer amount of information that exists in this universe. In fact, atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel, who's a professor of philosophy at New York University, wrote a book called Mind and Cosmos. Now remember, he's an atheist. And yet he says, and I quote, that there are two problems with Darwinian evolution. The first problem, and we'll get back to that, is the origin of life from non-living matter. Life emerging from non-living chemicals. He says that it's impossible for random processes and natural laws to explain and account for the origin of life from non-living matter. He says that atheists and evolutionary biologists simply cannot explain this. So that's the first problem. The second problem is the development of staggeringly diverse and highly complicated beings. For example, the brain. I mean, have you looked at a brain? Have you seen how complex it is? Have you seen the sheer amount of information that the brain processes and what it's capable of? The sheer complexity of it, he says, could never be generated by natural and random processes. Then he says, listen carefully to this. He says, I cannot bring myself to believe in Darwinian evolution. He says, I hope I won't have to appeal to the God hypothesis. This is who? This is Thomas Nagel, professor of philosophy. He says that we have these problems that represent insurmountable hurdles before Darwinian evolution. And so he now finds himself having to grapple with the only possible alternative. And so he says, I hope I don't have to appeal to the God hypothesis. He says that in the book. He says, because I don't want to live in a universe that has cosmic authority. But at this point, I'm stuck and I'm looking for options. Thomas Nagel, professor of philosophy at New York University. Now, there is so much to unpack here. Number one, the fact that he presents these insurmountable problems before Darwinian evolution, that he says there's no way we can explain these. And number two, the fact that he knows that the only other alternative is to believe in God. But he doesn't want to succumb to that. He doesn't want to surrender himself to what he calls cosmic authority because of other reasons, because of prejudices and biases and a lack of interest in submitting to a higher authority. The arrogance that I spoke about in the first session is, I think we're seeing a living example of that right here in this book. So there are scientific inconsistencies. The time frame is one of them in the theory of evolution that simply could not be explained by the mechanisms we find in that theory. The second critical flaw that I mentioned was the problem of definitions. And I just want to take a few minutes to talk about this because it's very important. And you know, the nature of this session is that it's condensed, it contains a lot of technical points, and I can understand how it could be a little confusing for some, but it is condensed. And as I said, I will give you some books to refer back to, inshallah, at the end. So the second critical flaw is that evolution is, there are problems in definitions, meaning it is not observable, because by definition, evolution takes millions of years, supposedly. And so what that means is that it renders the process of evolution beyond the scientific method. The scientific method involves observation, but no one has ever observed evolution taking place. Now I know some of you might be thinking that we have fossil records and we have vestigial organs and we have certain functions and we have organs within creatures and species that we can draw inferences from that would lead us to believe in evolution. But see, that's the operative word. Ultimately, you have to believe, you have to have faith in evolution being true and being factual, because nobody has ever observed it taking place. Why? Because again, they tell us that it takes millions of years. And because our lives are much shorter than that time frame, we have never observed it. So, setting aside the irony of atheists having to have faith in evolution as opposed to having real hard observable evidence, which is ironic in itself, because that's that's one of the things they use against theists and against believers, where they say that you have blind faith. But this is blind faith right there before our very eyes. But setting all of that aside, the problem with evolution, if defined, if what you mean by evolution is macroevolution, meaning the kind of evolution that would begin with certain chemicals and then evolving into the complex human beings that we see today in the 8.2 million other species. If that is what you mean by evolution, well, number one, it's not observable. And number two, we don't have any evidence of a change of kind of species, right? All the adaptations that take place, right? All of the changes that we have observed or we have evidence for, they don't change one kind of animal to another, right? In other words, cats have never been observed, or there's never been any hard evidence of cats changing into dogs, right? Cats are one kind of animal, dogs are another kind of animal. Again, we're not talking about speciesism, we're not talking about adaptations, we're talking about macroevolution. There has never been any evidence of that, never any observable hard evidence of that taking place. All the examples that are presented are examples in microevolution, meaning one species of animal adapts and evolves and changes into the same species, into the same kind. In other words, one type of moth fly into another kind of moth fly. But you never see that moth changing and adapting and evolving into a bird or into a dog or into a squirrel or into a whale or into a fish or anything like that. That has never ever been presented. So there is a big difference between microevolution and macroevolution. In order for the theory of evolution to even begin to think about undermining the need for a creator and an intelligent designer, it would have to work on a macro level, not a micro level. Giving me an example of some kind of microbe developing a new function and changing into another microbe, another species of microbe, is not good enough. You have to give us evidence where a reptile evolves into an amphibian, for example, or a fish evolving into a bird, or even animals that resemble each other, that look like each other. We have none of that. And so ultimately, people who subscribe to evolution have to have a leap of faith. They have to believe in something, and that's why you'll see that evolutionary scientists, they often use the language like maybe, perhaps, probably. There's no facts. There's no hard evidence. They'll say that maybe this happened, right? When in fact, if you remember in the first session, I read a verse on the Holy Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا لَهُمْ بِهِ مِنْ عِلْمٍ. They have no knowledge of this. إِن يَتَّبِعُونَ إِلَّا الظَّنَّ. Instead, they follow conjecture. They don't have knowledge of this. وَإِن الظَّنَّ لَا يُغْنِي مِنَ الْحَقِّ شَيْئًا. The problem is that conjecture and speculation will never replace the truth. It'll never replace facts. Whereas this is exactly what we see when people discussing evolution, right? So they have to take a leap of faith. And again, the irony is that this is the problem they have with theists. They say that you have faith in God. Well, you have faith in some kind of theory somehow working itself out, even though you don't have many of the essential components of that theory to even be called a scientific theory. You don't have that. For example, they have what's called the missing link, and they call it the missing link. In other words, it's not there. It's missing. It doesn't exist as far as the scientific body of evidence is concerned. But they still believe that maybe, hopefully, at some point, that missing link will emerge and it will solve their problem. It will fill that gap. Remember, we talked about the God of the gaps? The atheist is the one that believes in the God of the gaps, because their God is what they call scientific theories. And they try to use that. Wherever they have a gap, they'll say, maybe this, maybe that. A very good example of this, by the way, is what's called the multiverse theorem. And in a nutshell, I don't want to get into it, but they've tried to address one of the problems in creationism, which is to account for the incredible complexity and fine-tuning of the universe, and how if the universal laws of physics were to be changed even by the tiniest of fractions, it would not have the capacity to produce life as we know it. It wouldn't be able to function as well as it does today. In fact, it would be completely annihilated. It would be completely destroyed. It would never grow and develop the way it did. And so in order to address this problem, what they call the Goldilocks theory, they have come up with this idea that we don't just have one universe, but we have an infinity of universes, right? How many? They've suggested as high as 55 billion other universes. And they've said that, yes, the reason this universe seems so fine-tuned for life to exist and for us to be able to do what we do today, to think, to contemplate, to develop, to grow, because the reason this universe is so highly, finely tuned is because there have been 55 other billion universes. And so surely that one of them is bound to have worked out. One of them is bound to be as finely tuned as the one that we happen to be living in. But see, the problem with these atheists is that they will dismiss the existence of God with all the overwhelming evidence that there is for it, only to then believe in something they have zero evidence for. There is not a shred of evidence for the multiverse theory, not a shred. And so when asked about this, when presented with this problem, I remember there was an interview with Richard Dawkins, and he was asked point blank, do you have any evidence for this? And he said that we don't. But I'm hoping that within the next 150 years or so, that scientists or cosmologists or physicists will be able to come up with some kind of evidence to back this up. So he believes in something with zero evidence. He has no qualms with that, no problems with that, only to dismiss belief in God, which, having read the quote by the philosopher Thomas Nagel, it all makes sense, because they simply don't have the desire to surrender to a higher being, to a cosmic authority. Because they don't want to submit to that authority, they will dismiss the most obvious of facts and make a leap of faith in the most ludicrous of ideas just to do exactly that. So back to the second problem with the theory of evolution is that you have to decide which definition of evolution you're going to subscribe to, you're going to accept. Is it microevolution? Is it macroevolution? If it's microevolution, we don't have a problem with that. Yes, people adapt. Creatures and species will always adapt. You know, we see, for example, people who lose their eyesight only to then have a heightened sense in their other senses. For example, their hearing becomes much stronger. Their sense of smell and touch becomes much stronger because they now have no ability to see, and therefore they adapt. We don't have a problem with that. So adaptation and speciation, we don't have an issue with it. Those are all examples of microevolution, but they do not account for the fact that life exists today, and they cannot explain how life could have emerged from non-living chemicals and other objects. This is all we have, right? So one of the issues that they'll say is that evolution, macroevolution that is not observable because it takes millions of years. By the way, they say that there hasn't been much noticeable evolution, meaning from one kind of animal, one kind of creature to another over the last 2 million years, which suggests, again, according to the fossil record, this suggests to us, listen carefully, that 2 million years and we don't see any major evolutionary biology taking place. Now, if that is true, then for every new function, for every change from one kind of animal to another, it takes no less than 2 million years. And if that is the case, we go back to the first problem, which is a timeline being inconsistent. This means that it would take thousands of billions of years for evolution to work the way it's supposed to. Because remember, evolution is based on trial and error. Evolution is mindless. Evolution depends on random mutations in the genetic code. This is how they describe it. If that's the case, then again, being trial and error, it means that one function has to develop, one creature turns into another, and it would have to fail 1,000 times before it actually works, right? On a cellular level, it would have to fail so many times before it finally produces the function that is desired, that helps it adapt and helps it survive, right? It's all about survival. So it would take thousands and thousands of billions of years. We're talking trillions and trillions, which is why Thomas Nagel said that the theory of evolution, and atheists will never be able to explain to me how we went from A to B, given the timeline that we have, right? So there are many examples that have been presented which also contradict with the theory of evolution and the issue of macro versus microevolution. Again, I don't want to get into that, but one simple example which was, again, used and touted for so many decades about it being an example of poor design as well as evolution is the appendix, right? So they've said, again, I remember even as a child, we used to read this in science textbooks, they would say that the appendix is a vestigial organ. It's an ancient relic. It might have served some purpose in our ancestors, 10 million years ago, but now it's completely useless. It serves no real purpose whatsoever, which is why they used to suggest back then that if you can take out your appendix to avert any potential problems that could come up of pus and leftover food would end up there and causing it to inflame and cause all sorts of problems. So they used to suggest that you should probably take it out. The same is with the wisdom tooth, right? But I'll focus on the appendix now. So it was vestigial, it was completely useless. Only to then, I think back in 2017, 18, if I remember correctly, researchers at Duke University came up with an absolutely critical function for the appendix, which involves storing of bacteria in times where there is an infection in the body. And for example, in the case of extreme diarrhea, certain bacteria would be stored in the appendix, and the bacteria would then be restored it would be used by the body to fight those infections within the body, thanks to the appendix. In other words, it's a pouch that stores critical medicine for the times that you so desperately need it. But again, all these years you've been told, oh, this is poor design, this is vestigial, this is an ancient relic, this is proof of evolution, and now we know that it in fact serves a very critical purpose indeed. So, problem number 3. I said that the third critical flaw in the theory of evolution is that it's an exercise in futility and it doesn't serve the intended purpose of refuting God. And what that means is that even if, let's say, not just microevolution, but let's say macroevolution is also true, even though it has all those critical flaws, right? For example, I didn't even get to talk about irreducible complexity, right? The fact that if you reverse engineer the evolutionary tree and you go all the way back to the first cell, there are some basic functions in a cell which you cannot reduce further than that. Let me actually, before I get to point number 3, I'll give you some example of that. How did mammals see before we developed and evolved eyesight? Because again, if you reverse engineer it all the way back to the point of inception, then all of these functions didn't exist. Being able to see did not exist. We didn't have the eyes, right? So prior to that, how did we see? How did we interact? How did we mate? How did we live? How did we procure food, right? Another example is the epiglottis. Do you know what the epiglottis is? It is your Adam's apple, right? It is the organ or the apparatus that prevents food from going down your windpipe and ending up in your lungs. Without the epiglottis, we would all choke to death every time we ate something, because the food or the water would go down our windpipe and it would choke us to death. It would kill us. Amir al-Mu'mineen beautifully talks about this, and he says, Miskeen ibn Adam, taqtuluhu al-sharqa wa tuntinuhu al-arqa wa tu'dhihi al-baqqa. He says, human beings are so weak and vulnerable that he talks about his sympathy towards human beings. And he says, you know, humans think that they're so big and strong and they can challenge anything and they can even challenge God, where in fact, the simplest things, like taking a bite of food, could end up choking him, could end up killing us if the epiglottis didn't do what it was supposed to do. If the epiglottis wasn't there, we would die. We couldn't survive, we couldn't eat, we couldn't store energy and food. And the point here being, and the question I'm asking you is, how did we eat prior to the epiglottis evolving? How did that happen? And there's no answer for that. There's no answer for that if you're being scientific. Of course, evolutionary scientists will say, well, maybe this, maybe that, but there is no factual basis for any of those answers. Another example, as I said, is irreducible complexity. If you go back all the way to the first cell from which we evolved, right? There were some basic functions in that cell which you cannot reduce further. Because by definition, evolution means that if you go all the way back, you start out with some chemicals, and those chemicals would somehow magically produce life, right? And ostensibly that life would involve some kind of a cellular mechanism. Well, how do you go from those chemicals to that cell without being able to reduce the complexity of that cell? I know, again, this is, rather technical language, but it is important, and these are discussions that are being presented in universities and at the level where theists and atheists are interacting with each other, right? Irreducible complexity is a big problem for which they have no answer. Problem number 3, as I said, was that it's an exercise in futility, meaning that even if you did believe in evolution, even if somehow you overcame all of those hurdles and answered all of those unanswered questions, it doesn't take away the need for God. I'll give you a couple of examples. So Many of you probably don't remember, but back in the 90s, there was this thing called the Human Genome Project, or even prior to that, the Human Genome Project. I think it was started in the 1960s, if I'm not mistaken. You're all familiar with the helix shape of the human DNA, right? So this project was started by a number of individuals. One of them was Francis Crick. Another was Francis Collins. So Francis Collins, interestingly, wrote a book, and the book's title is The Language of God, right? That's also a recommended reading for you to refer to. The Language of God, in which he talks about how his discovery of the human genome, mapping the human genetic code, led him to belief in God. That there was no other answer but to believe in God. The sheer complexity and the amount of information in the DNA, forget everything else, forget the human organs, forget all the functions, the DNA itself, which is at the core of the cell. So, The Language of God. Another really good book, by the way, for those interested, is by Stephen Meyer, and he's written a number of books about evolution and debunking evolution. One of them is called Darwin's Doubt, so do check that out if you're interested. But I want to focus on one individual who was very much instrumental in the Human Genome Project, and that was Francis Crick. He wrote a book called Life Itself. And in order to overcome the hurdles of evolution, of the biggest one being how life could emerge from non-living matter and non-living chemicals, he says the following in a quote. He says that some form of primordial life came to Earth billions of years ago via spaceships, and this life that came to Earth was more evolved. It was more evolved, and he suggests that it was alien creatures. In other words, let me help you get this right. In other words, God didn't create this. There was no intelligent designer. There was no creator. There was no God, because they don't have enough evidence for that, right? But they're happy to believe in aliens who came to the Earth using spaceships and he calls them primordial life. In other words, they've been around for infinity, and they came here and they planted the human DNA. You see how ludicrous this is? You see how arrogant this is? They're not willing to believe in God, but they're willing to put their blind faith in something they have absolutely no evidence for whatsoever. The point I'm trying to make here is this, is that even if we believe in evolution, this process could not have been mindless. It could not have been random. It could not have been without some kind of designer supervising every single step of it. It couldn't have happened. Because to have anything rather than nothing, you need God. To have life rather than death, you need a creator. The mere fact that we exist here today, whether we've been evolved or not, whether we've mutated or not, whether we are able to fly, which, by the way, if evolution is about adaptation, if evolution is about survival of the fittest, surely being able to fly would have been at the top of the agenda of this mindless process that we call natural selection and evolution. Surely we should have been able to fly now, because when it comes to our survival, flying is absolutely integral, if not just useful. But again, whether we have all those or not, whether we believe in all of this or not, you need to have a creator, because how could you have anything rather than nothing without a God? I'll wrap up with that. Inshallah, we'll continue the discussion. At the end of the day, my dear brothers and sisters, the Quran speaks in a language that is intrinsic. The Quran doesn't need to resort to philosophical arguments. Instead, it speaks a language that we all understand. أَفِي اللَّهِ شَكٌّ. Is there any doubt? If you try to remove the cloud of suspicion and doubt and misconception, if you clean the lenses of your glasses a little bit, if you try to see the world for what it is and truly objectively observe the meticulous design, the beautiful creation, the fact that there is something rather than nothing, you will come to the inevitable conclusion, as Francis Collins did, that God must exist. أَفِي اللَّهِ شَكٌّ فَاطِرِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. When you observe the lives of people like Hussein alayhi salam, the Ahlul Bayt, Rasulullah, Amirul Mu'mineen, Fatima, Al-Hasan, Al-Hussein, when you see how they interacted with the world around them, when you see how they responded to the challenges around them, when you see their kindness, their compassion, when you see their strength in the face of unspeakable tragedy, you have no choice but to surrender to the very same truth that they subscribe to. Imam al-Hussein looks down only to see his 6-month-old sweetheart, his beloved Ali al-Asghar, slaughtered from ear to ear, بِأَبِي هُوَ وَأُمِّي. And the first thing that he says is هَوَّنَ مَا نَزَلَ بِي أَنَّهُ بِعَيْنِ اللَّهِ. What makes this pain bearable for me, what allows me to observe this sight and not die in grief and anguish, is that I know God is watching over me. I know Allah is observing me. أنه بعين الله. إلهي إن كان هذا يرضيك فخذ حتى ترضى. He says, oh Allah, if this pleases you, then take until you are satisfied. Take everything I have to offer until you are pleased with me, you are happy with me. Until you are pleased that this sacrifice won't go unrewarded, until you are satisfied that the sacrifice of Hussein and his family and his children and his companions and his brothers and his cousins is enough to spark faith in God for eternity. That's why so many people discover God when they board the ark of Hussein, when they hear of the sacrifice of Hussein. بِأَبِي أَنْتَ وَأُمِّي يَا أَبَا عَبْدِ اللَّهِ. This tragedy, by the way, is one of the single most painful on the heart of Abu Abdullah and the family of Imam al-Hussein, which is why his daughter says that on the eve of the 11th of Muharram, I went out looking for my aunt Zainab, only to see her sitting by a pile of swords and spears and daggers. I said to her, my aunt Zainab, who are you talking to? What is under all of this? My aunt said to me, Innahu abuki, this is your father. Then she says that I heard a faint voice coming from the pile of swords and spears and shields. And this is mentioned in Bihar al-Anwar by Allam al-Majlisi. This is the poem of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. He said there, Shi'ati mahma sharibtum عذب ماء فاذكروني أو سمعتم بغريب أو قتيل فاندبوني. Oh my followers, whenever you drink fresh water, think of me. Whenever you hear someone is abandoned, remember me. فأنا السبط الذي من غير جرم قتلوني. Oh, Abinal, I am the one, the grandson of Rasulullah, who was killed without a crime. وبجرد الخيل بعد القتل ظلما سحقوني. And if that wasn't enough, they then trampled my body with the hooves of their horses after they killed me. Imam al-Hussein mentions these tragedies to you and I, but then he focuses on one tragedy. Which one is it, Ya Sahib al-Zaman? He says, ليتكم في يوم عاشوراء جميعا تنظروني كيف أستسقي لطفلي فأبوا أن يرحموني. I wish you were there on Ashura watching me, how I asked for water for my infant, but they showed no mercy to me. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون. وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون. Oh Allah, by the sacred blood of Aba Abdullah and Ali al-Asghar, hasten the reappearance of our master, Sahib al-Zaman. Oh Allah, make us among his sincere servants. Oh Allah, make us among his loyal companions and supporters. بمحمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل على محمد.
Thank you for that, Maulana Sab. Can I please call upon Zainal to recite a Noha?
प्यारे नबी की प्यारे नवासी शाम को खैरी बन के चली है। प्यारे नबी की प्यारे नवासी शाम को खैरी बन के चली है। सब्र के मलिका तेरा की प्यारी शाम को खैरी बन के चली है।
प्यारे नबी की प्यारी नवासी शाम को कैदी बन के चली है।
देख रही है कोई दुआए प्राण पकड़ कर काश बिताए। ना है सवाई ना है हमारी शाम को खैरी बन के चली है।
प्यारे नबी की प्यारी नवासी शाम को कैदी बन के चली है।
भाई भतीजे भांजे बेटे साथ वतन से आई थी लेके। हाय मुक़द्दर आज अकेली शाम को खैदी बन कर चली है।
प्यारे नबी की प्यारी नवासी शाम को कैदी बन के चली है।
प्रीतों को सदका भाई पे करके जिसने किए थे शुक्र के सदरे जोर के तन्हा लाश को उसकी
शाम को कैदी बन के चली है। प्यारे नबी की پیاری نواسی شام کو قیدی بن کے چلی ہے
جس کی کنیزیں نکلے نہ باہر بلوے میں لائے اس کو ستمگر ہائے قربات بنت علی کی
شام کو قیدی بن کے چلی ہے پیارے نبی کی پیاری نواسی شام کو قیدی بن کے چلی ہے
کتنے ہی قیدی جس نے چرائے آج وہ بی سر کو جھکائے ایک پیدا کی بن کے سوالی
شام کو قیدی بن کے چلی ہے پیارے نبی کی پیاری نواسی شام کو قیدی بن کے چلی ہے حسین حسین حسین
بیٹا مائک آن کیجیے.
Very well done, and thank you for that recitation. Can I also please call upon Sajjad Rizvi to recite a Noha?
یا رب کوئی معصومہ زندہ میں نہ تنہا ہو یا رب کوئی معصومہ زندہ میں نہ تنہا ہو یا رب کوئی معصومہ زندہ میں نہ تنہا ہو یا رب کوئی معصومہ زندہ میں نہ تنہا ہو یا رب کوئی معصومہ زندہ میں نہ تنہا ہو پابند نہ ہو آہیں ہے پابند نہ ہو آہیں رونے پہ نہ پہرا ہو یا رب کوئی معصومہ زندہ میں نہ تنہا ہو یا رب کوئی معصومہ زندہ میں نہ تنہا ہو تھی جس کو نیند آتی شبیر کے سینے پر تھی جس کو نیند آتی شبیر کے سینے پر زندہ در زندہ ہے زندہ در زندہ اس کے لیے قضا ہو یا رب کوئی معصومہ زندہ میں نہ تنہا ہو یا رب کوئی معصومہ زندہ میں نہ تنہا ہو زندانوں سے آتی تھی آواز سسکنے کی زندانوں سے آتی تھی آواز سسکنے کی جیسے کہ سکینہ کو ہے جیسے کہ سکینہ کو ہر زندان رو رہا ہو یا رب کوئی معصومہ زندہ میں نہ تنہا ہو یا رب کوئی معصومہ زندہ میں نہ تنہا ہو ٹکرائے نہ وہ کیوں کر زندہ کی دیواروں سے ٹکرائے نہ وہ کیوں کر زندہ کی دیواروں سے بھائی سے اور پھوپھی سے ہے بھائی سے اور پھوپھی سے جس کو جدا کیا ہو یا رب کوئی معصومہ زندہ میں نہ تنہا ہو یا رب کوئی معصومہ زندہ میں نہ تنہا ہو تھی جس کو نیند آتی شبیر کے سینے پر تھی جس کو نیند آتی شبیر کے سینے پر زندہ در زندہ ہے زندہ در زندہ، اس کے لیے قضا ہو یا رب کوئی معصومہ، زندہ میں نہ تنہا ہو یا رب کوئی معصومہ، زندہ میں نہ تنہا ہو یا رب کوئی معصومہ، زندہ میں نہ تنہا ہو یا رب کوئی معصومہ، زندہ میں نہ تنہا ہو، پابند نہ ہو آہیں، ہے پابند نہ ہو آہیں، رونے پہ نہ پہرا ہو یا رب کوئی معصومہ، زندہ میں نہ تنہا ہو یا رب کوئی معصومہ، زندہ میں نہ تنہا ہو، یا حسین یا حسین.
Okay. MashaAllah, thank you, Sajjad. We would now like to thank everyone who joined us tonight, and we'll now conclude the Majlis with the ziyarat. Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdullah, Assalamu alayka ya Ibna Rasulullah, Assalamu alayka ya Ibna Amir al-Mu'mineen, Assalamu alayka ya Fatimatu Zahra, Assalamu alayka ya Abul Fazl Abbas, Assalamu alaykum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Assalamu alayka ya Gharib al-Ghuraba, Assalamu alayka ya Ali ibn Musa Riza, Assalamu alaykum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Assalamu alayka ya Sahib al-Asr wa Zaman, Assalamu alayka ya Imam al-Insi wal-Jan, Assalamu alayka ya Sharik al-Quran, Alaman, 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 Assalamu alaykum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum.